My name is Robert Sinclair, and I am 77 years old. 2 weeks ago, at a family dinner at my son's house, he noticed an old pair of worn combat boots I'd absent-mindedly left by the front door after doing some yard work in them earlier that day, and he made a comment, laughing in front of his wife and visiting in-laws, that his father still clomped around in ancient army surplus junk that probably should have been thrown out decades ago, the kind of thing, he said, that made him wonder if I even remembered where half my old belongings actually came from. Everyone at the table laughed politely. 2 weeks later, my son's newly assigned commanding officer, meeting him for the first time since a recent transfer, asked him directly whether he was related to a Robert Sinclair who'd served with a specific reconnaissance unit in the early 1970s, and when my son confirmed, confused, that yes, that was his father, the commanding officer stood up from his own desk and asked, with visible reverence, whether he might be permitted to call and speak with me personally. If you've ever had a piece of your history dismissed as forgettable junk by someone who never bothered to ask what it actually meant, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my son wrong for a careless comment about old boots. It's about what happens when the past you've kept quietly folded away for decades suddenly, unexpectedly, walks back into the room through the exact door you never thought it would. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what that commanding officer said once he got me on the phone. I need to tell you about those boots, and about the years behind them, before I tell you about that dinner table, because otherwise a careless comment about old army surplus junk won't carry the weight it's actually supposed to carry. I enlisted in the Army in 1967, 19 years old, out of a small town outside of Spokane, Washington, at a moment when a young man from a town like mine didn't have many illusions about where enlistment would eventually lead. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, the first as a rifleman, the second, following a transfer request I made myself, as part of a specialized long-range reconnaissance patrol unit, work that took small teams of us deep into contested territory for extended periods, gathering intelligence under conditions that demanded a particular kind of endurance and discretion I don't think I fully understood the weight of until I was already living inside it. I want to tell you specifically about those boots, because they matter enormously to understanding everything that happened at that dinner table. I was issued that particular pair in early 1971, during my second tour, and I wore them through 11 months of reconnaissance operations in terrain that tested equipment and men in ways that peacetime training simply couldn't replicate. Those boots carried me through swamps and mountain terrain, through a specific 18-day patrol in the spring of 1971 that I still, even now, 54 years later, find genuinely difficult to discuss in full detail. An operation during which my 4-man team gathered intelligence on enemy troop movements that, according to information passed back to me years later through old service connections, directly influenced a significant tactical decision that saved American lives in a subsequent, larger engagement. I remember specifically the particular quality of that 18-day patrol, the way exhaustion accumulates differently when you're operating in small, isolated teams deep in contested territory, unable to rely on the kind of support and backup that larger units might expect. I remember the specific discipline required to move silently through terrain that seemed designed to betray your presence at every step, the particular mental toll of maintaining absolute vigilance for days at a stretch, knowing that a single mistake could cost not just your own life but the lives of the 3 men depending on you to move and think clearly alongside them. My boots, by the end of that patrol, had taken on a particular molded shape that I remember noticing even at the time, evidence of exactly how much weight and distance they'd absorbed across those 18 days. I came home in 1971, and like so many veterans of that particular war, I found the transition back to civilian life considerably more complicated than anyone had adequately prepared me for. I kept those boots, not out of any particular sentimentality in the moment, but simply because they were serviceable, well broken in, comfortable in the specific way that gear becomes comfortable once it's shaped itself to your exact body over months of hard use. I wore them for yard work and home repairs for decades afterward, never thinking twice about the specific history embedded in that worn leather, treating them the way you treat any genuinely useful old tool, valued for its continued function rather than any conscious reverence for its origin. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to understanding the rest of this story. I never discussed the specifics of that reconnaissance work with my own family, not in any real detail. Some of what I did during those 11 months remained, for decades, information I understood I wasn't meant to discuss casually, given the specific nature of intelligence-gathering operations, and even once enough time had passed that formal restrictions would have loosened considerably, I found I simply preferred to keep that chapter separate from my role as a husband and father, a boundary I maintained across the following 5 decades more out of habit and personal temperament than any remaining formal requirement. I married my wife Diane in 1974, and she knew, in general terms, that I had served in a specialized capacity during my second tour. But she respected, throughout our 49 years of marriage until her passing 3 years ago, my preference to keep the specific operational details largely private, an act of patience I've thought about often in the years since losing her. Diane had a particular gift for understanding when silence needed to be respected, rather than pushed against, having grown up herself with a father who'd carried his own quiet weight from the Second World War, and she recognized, early in our marriage, that whatever I'd brought home from that reconnaissance work lived in a place that didn't respond well to direct questioning, requiring patience rather than pressure. We raised one son, David, born in 1977, and I want to be honest that raising him while carrying decades of quiet, largely undiscussed military history created a particular distance between us that I don't think either of us fully addressed until very recently. I remember specific moments across David's childhood, evenings when a particular sound or a specific date on the calendar would shift my mood in ways I never explained, and I remember Diane gently managing those moments on my behalf, offering David some general, age-appropriate explanation without ever revealing details I wasn't prepared to share even with her fully. David grew up knowing his father had served in Vietnam, a fact mentioned occasionally but never explored in any depth, absorbed into his general understanding of me the way children absorb background facts about their parents, without any particular curiosity to investigate further, especially given how carefully I'd kept any visible reminders of that specific chapter separate from our ordinary family life. I kept those boots, along with a handful of other service-related items, in a corner of the garage rather than displayed anywhere inside the house itself, a physical manifestation of the same boundary I maintained conversationally, keeping that chapter of my life quite literally separate from the space where our family actually lived. David eventually followed his own path into military service himself, joining the Army at 22, a decision that genuinely moved me, though I want to be honest, that our relationship around his own service developed its own particular complexity over the following decades. David built a solid, respectable career, eventually reaching the rank of major, currently serving in a logistics and operations role after a recent transfer to a new base assignment. I want to be fair to David here, because it would be easy to paint him simply as disrespectful, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's been, in most respects, a devoted son, someone who calls regularly, who has always expressed general pride in my service, even if that pride was built on a considerably thinner understanding of the specifics than either of us, I think, fully realized until 2 weeks ago. What I've noticed over the years, particularly as David's own military career developed its own visible markers of accomplishment, promotions, commendations, assignments he could discuss openly at family gatherings, is a subtle but real pattern where my own service, precisely because so much of it remained undiscussed and undocumented in any way David had direct access to, came to occupy a smaller, less significant space in his overall understanding of our family's military legacy, overshadowed, in his own mind, by the more visible, easily explained shape of his own career. 2 weeks ago, we gathered for a family dinner at David's house, an occasion that included his wife, Melissa, along with her parents, who were visiting from out of state. A fairly formal family gathering that I attended, as I typically do, wearing ordinary civilian clothes appropriate for a dinner, rather than any reminder of my military history. Melissa had prepared an elaborate meal, clearly wanting to make a good impression for her visiting parents, and the early part of the evening moved warmly, conversation drifting easily between David's recent transfer, Melissa's parents' travels, and general family catching up. I want to tell you about the specific circumstances that led to those boots being present at all, because the detail matters to understanding exactly what unfolded. I'd arrived a couple of hours before dinner, at David's request, to help him with some yard work ahead of his in-laws' visit, clearing some fallen branches and doing minor repairs around the property, work for which I'd changed into old, practical clothes, including that same pair of combat boots, still serviceable enough after 54 years that I continued reaching for them whenever genuinely rugged outdoor work was involved. I'd left them by the front door afterward, intending to change into more appropriate footwear before dinner, a task that, in the general bustle of preparing for guests, I'd simply forgotten to complete. The boots, sitting quietly by the entrance throughout the entire evening, visible to anyone who glanced that direction from the dining room table. Dinner began, and about halfway through the meal, during a lull in the broader conversation, Melissa's father noticed the boots still sitting by the entrance, visible from the dining room table, and asked, with genuine friendly curiosity, whose old military boots those were, gesturing toward them with his fork. David laughed, glancing toward the boots with an expression I recognized immediately as mild, affectionate exasperation, rather than anything genuinely unkind, though the words themselves landed with a weight he clearly hadn't anticipated. "Those are my dad's," David said, gesturing toward me with a chuckle. "Honestly, Dad, I don't know why you still clomp around in ancient army surplus junk that probably should have been thrown out decades ago. I swear, half the stuff in your garage is stuff you probably don't even remember where it came from anymore, just old junk you've held onto out of habit." Melissa's parents laughed politely, the kind of laugh people offer at a mild, affectionate family joke, rather than anything they'd thought carefully about, and the conversation moved naturally toward other topics. David clearly not intending any particular cruelty, simply making a casual observation about what he perceived as his father's general tendency toward holding on to old, unremarkable belongings. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though some sting was certainly present. Men of my generation, particularly those of us who carried the specific weight of reconnaissance work that, by its nature, was never meant to be openly discussed or celebrated, develop a certain capacity to absorb this kind of casual dismissal without much visible reaction. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a tired, familiar recognition of exactly how completely my own decades of chosen silence had shaped my own son's understanding of objects, and by extension a life that actually carried considerably more weight than ancient army surplus junk. I didn't correct him, I simply smiled, made some mild comment about old habits being hard to break, and the dinner continued pleasantly. The specific sting of that moment folded quietly away alongside decades of similar, smaller moments I'd simply learned to absorb without comment. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advanced knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to understanding why it carried the weight it eventually did. David had recently transferred to a new base assignment, a logistics and operations position under a newly assigned commanding officer he hadn't yet had extensive direct interaction with beyond initial formal introductions. About 2 weeks after that dinner, David had his first substantive one-on-one meeting with this commanding officer, Colonel James Hartwell, a meeting intended primarily to review David's assignment and immediate priorities in his new role. David told me, during the phone call that would eventually follow, that the meeting had proceeded through its formal agenda items smoothly enough, until Colonel Hartwell, reviewing David's personnel file, paused on a specific detail listing David's father's name as an emergency contact, a standard piece of administrative information that had apparently caught the colonel's attention in a way David hadn't anticipated. "Major Sinclair," Colonel Hartwell said, "according to David's account, I need to ask you something, and I apologize if this seems like an unusual question in this context. Is your father named Robert Sinclair? Did he serve in a long-range reconnaissance capacity during Vietnam, specifically around 1971? David confirmed, genuinely confused about why this particular detail had drawn such specific attention from a commanding officer he'd barely met. Colonel Hartwell's entire demeanor shifted, according to David, in a way he described as almost startling to witness, in a man whose bearing had, until that moment, remained entirely formal and professional. "Major," Colonel Hartwell said, "I need you to understand something. My own father served as an infantry lieutenant in Vietnam, in a unit that, during the spring of 1971, was operating in a specific contested region where intelligence gathered by a 4-man reconnaissance team over an 18-day patrol directly informed a tactical decision that my father has told me, more times than I can count across my entire life, saved his own life and the lives of everyone under his command during a subsequent engagement. My father has spent decades trying to identify and thank the specific men from that reconnaissance team, information that remained difficult to access given the specific classification restrictions around that particular operation. If your father is the Robert Sinclair I believe he might be, Major, my own father has been waiting over 50 years for the chance to properly thank the man who, in a very real sense, is part of the reason I exist at all, since my father wouldn't have survived that engagement without the intelligence your father's team provided. I want you to understand what David told me about his own reaction in that moment, sitting across from a commanding officer he'd known for barely 2 weeks, absorbing information about his own father that fundamentally reorganized decades of assumptions he'd never once thought to question. David called me that same evening, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard from him in longer than I could remember, something considerably more unsteady than his usual composed, professional manner. "Dad," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you serve on a long-range reconnaissance patrol in the spring of 1971? An 18-day operation?" I felt my chest tighten, understanding immediately where this conversation was heading. Decades of carefully maintained privacy suddenly, unexpectedly intersecting with a conversation I genuinely never anticipated having with my own son in quite these terms. "I did," I said quietly. "That's not something I've ever discussed in detail with you, David, for reasons that made sense to me at the time, and that I'm still, honestly, working through even now." There was a long, stunned silence on the line before David spoke again, his voice breaking. "Dad, my new commanding officer's father, was an infantry lieutenant whose unit survived a major engagement specifically because of intelligence your reconnaissance team gathered during that exact operation. Colonel Hartwell says his father has been trying to find and thank you for over 50 years. Dad, 2 weeks ago at dinner, I made fun of your old boots, called them junk you probably didn't even remember the origin of, and it turns out those boots were on your feet during the exact mission that a man I've never met has spent half a century wanting to thank you for." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, hearing my son's genuine shock, the particular disorientation of a man realizing that an object he'd casually dismissed, without a second thought, carried a weight considerably more significant than he'd ever imagined possible. "David," I said, "I heard what you said at dinner. I understand you didn't know, and I understand why you wouldn't have, given how little I've ever volunteered about that particular chapter. I'm not upset about the comment itself, but I think we should probably talk properly now, since apparently the past has decided it isn't finished with either of us yet." Colonel Hartwell called me himself the following week, and I want to be honest about how genuinely overwhelming that conversation was. A man I'd never met, connected to me through his own father's survival, spending nearly an hour on the phone conveying, with evident emotion, exactly what that 18-day patrol had meant to his own family across 3 generations. He arranged, with my permission, a call between myself and his father, retired Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hartwell, now 82 years old, a conversation I will genuinely carry with me for whatever years I have remaining. 2 old soldiers finally connecting across more than 5 decades of separation, Harold expressing a gratitude so profound and so long carried that I found myself, more than once during that call, genuinely unable to speak through my own emotion. David and I talked for several hours that first evening, a conversation considerably more honest than anything we'd managed across nearly 5 decades of his life. I told him, carefully, in pieces I genuinely never assembled out loud for anyone outside a small circle of fellow veterans, about that 18-day patrol, about the specific weight of gathering intelligence under conditions that left almost no margin for error, about carrying those same boots through terrain that tested every piece of equipment and every ounce of endurance I possessed. "Dad," David said, near the end of that conversation, "why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I've spent my entire life thinking I understood your service in general terms, and it turns out there was an entire dimension I never had access to, one that apparently saved actual lives in ways I'm only now learning about secondhand, from a stranger." "I think," I said slowly, "I convinced myself, decades ago, that keeping that chapter quiet was simply who I was, rather than a choice I was actively continuing to make. Every single day, I didn't bring it up. I think the silence became comfortable in a way that had less to do with genuine necessity and more to do with simple habit, and I let that habit continue for 54 years without ever seriously questioning whether it was actually serving either of us well. In the 2 weeks since that phone call, something has genuinely shifted in how David relates to me. He's asked, more than once, real questions about my service, about that specific patrol, about what it had actually felt like carrying that particular weight quietly for over 5 decades. He's also, I've learned, retrieved those same boots from my garage, having asked if he could have them properly preserved and displayed, wanting, in his words, to make sure that a piece of history that had directly shaped another family's entire existence across 3 generations wasn't simply left forgotten by a front door, waiting to be dismissed as junk by someone who never had reason to know better. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old veteran whose boots were mocked at a family dinner. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The objects and the silences we carry from difficult chapters of our lives sometimes hold considerably more weight than the people closest to us have any way of knowing, simply because we ourselves, for whatever reason, duty, habit, simple discretion, never gave them the material to understand differently. That doesn't mean the real cost of that silence isn't genuine, and it doesn't mean the truth, once it finally surfaces, arrives in ways we could ever have planned or expected. I spent 54 years wearing a pair of boots that carried me through one of the most consequential operations of my military service, boots my own son dismissed as forgettable junk without a second thought. It took an entirely unplanned coincidence, a chance meeting between my son and the son of a man whose life my own service had once saved, to finally reveal exactly what those boots, and the silence surrounding them, had actually represented all along. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family whose full history you might not fully know, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.